Hi, everyone. As you know, we're talking about racism in the criminal justice system again this week. And in order to chart our path through that discussion, let's start with some basics. Now, I mentioned in our last meeting that there was a problem with the way that the author of the textbook we've been using defined race. And as a consequence of that, there's a problem with how that author defines racism. So let's review really quickly what's wrong with that definition. The author refers to a 1997 definition of race and states that race refers to groups of persons who are relatively alike in their biological inheritance and are distinct from other groups. The problem I have with that definition is this phrase biological inheritance. And I want to make the case that race isn't really about what's happening biologically with people at all. Rather, it's based on a myth about biology, but it's really a socially created process. In 2020, and particularly among social scientists, including sociologists, race is understood to be a socially created hierarchical system of classification that depends on the assumption of shared descent and innate physical attributes. Some of those innate physical characteristics that this definition is referring to might be skin color, it might be the shape of one's nose, it might be the texture of their hair. It can be a number of characteristics or a combination of those characteristics. So again, to reiterate, what I'm saying is that race is socially constructed. It is not based on biology or biological inheritance. To put this in even more stark terms, I would say that DNA does not make us white or black or Asian, Arab, Hispanic. None of these so-called racial groups are determined through the makeup of their DNA. Now, this might sound controversial at first. After all, the way that we're able to tell the difference between people of different races is by looking at them. At least that's what we tell ourselves. And we see that in the example of skin color, that people with darker skin, if you simply notice that they have darker skin, you're going to be alerted to the fact that they might be in the racial group that we call Black, or they might be in the racial group that we call Latino. And so how would I counter? I would say that that's right as far as it goes, but consider this, that there are differences between any two individuals, right? So if you look at my face, I have these eyebrows that have a pretty horizontal shape to them. Some people, you'll notice they've got a little crescent shape up here. I have blue eyes. Some people have different color eyes. My nose is very pronounced. Some people, their noses are a little bit flatter. Some people we would call white, their noses are a little bit flatter. Lips, are they thick? Are they thin? There's all sorts of variation in human populations. I also like to point out to earlobes. Sometimes earlobes are attached, sometimes they're not. I'm bringing these characteristics up because all of these characteristics share something in common with skin color, or they share something in common with hair texture. And that is that they're readily visible. But unlike race, we don't go around and look at people's earlobe and see whether it's connected or not as a determining feature of whether they're members of a particular group. We don't think that people with attached earlobes belong to the same group, nor do we think that people with the same general shape of eyebrow belong to a particular group. So what's happening here is we're taking these characteristics of variation which exist between any two people or three people or four, and we're socially, through a shared meaning with other people, deciding that those characteristics count as salient. They count as the reason why these people should be considered a part of the same group. That's why race is a social construct. If to look at this from a geneticist point of view or a biological point of view, if you are to do an assessment of all of the genetic variation within any two individuals, okay, you're not going to find that two white people have more genetic information in common with each other than, say, a white person and a black person, or a black person and a Chinese person. That race is a terrible predictor for similarity, genetic similarity, biological based similarity between two individuals. And that's why we need that word assumed in the definition of race, that race is based on a assumption of shared descent and innate physical attributes. Okay, but for those of you who are still a little bit hazy as to why race has nothing to do with biology, let me come at this in a little bit different angle. Sociologists and historically oriented sociologists have known for quite some time that there are these processes that happen in human history that we can chart. It's in recorded history. They're called the processes of racialization, which is to say that some groups of people get racialized. They become identified as belonging to a particular group that until that moment in history didn't even exist. And so one example of this would be the Irish. Okay, so Irish immigration to the United States, and I'm sure many of you have heard that Irish arriving in the United States weren't looked on as another group of white folks, right? Whiteness itself as a racial group had to be kind of constructed. Who belonged to that group varied, and it wasn't a given. What happened soon after Irish people began arriving to the United States is that they worked to kind of make the case that in fact they were white, and over time began to be seen as white in the United States. So the Irish is the popular example, but it's not the only example. You can look at Arab Americans. There have been a number of racial formations, racializations throughout history. Sociologist Louise A. Kanker notes this about Arab Americans. She did an exhaustive history. Arab Americans were, quote, once seen as white, and as such, they benefited from a range of rights that were available to whites and denied other members of groups ascribed as non-white. They later experienced a reversal of that status, and she notes that that reversal began to happen in the early 20th century. By the time of 9/11, the idea that Arab Americans were anything but white and that they were a distinct other racial group began to be cemented in the kind of the collective imagination of everyday Americans. And so this leads to one of the most important questions that we can settle on, and that is race real? And as I've been saying, in a biological sense, in the sense of our DNA, is race a real thing? The answer is no. Race is not real. But race is real in its consequences because we treat it as something that's real, that's biologically real. We actually create hierarchical systems. Some people have more privilege than others. Some people have more power than others. And some people have more resources than others. In the United States and in many other countries around the world, as it turns out, there's a whiteness, a white supremacy that is at play. White folks have more power, privilege, and resources than do Black and brown folks. This isn't just my opinion. This can be quantified and has been quantified. It's been shown repeatedly over and over again. So is race real? Not really, but it's real in its consequences. This understanding of race leads to what I think is a more robust understanding of what constitutes racism. Racism is the prejudice and discrimination that is based on race and denies certain groups access to power, privilege, and resources. And again, in the context of the United States, this includes Black folks, Latinx, Asian, Arab Americans. Increasingly, it involves Muslim Americans who aren't the same as Arab Americans, although they often get lumped together within this one group. You may be asking yourself, but Muslims are a religious group. They're not a racial group. And I think in sort of a Webster's dictionary sense, you're correct. But The racial formations, racialization processes in the United States don't care much about Webster's. And what's happened is that there's been this move towards people talking about Muslim Americans as if you can predict how they're going to look, not just what they wear, but their actual facial features. This research has been interesting, and it's come out of actual looking at police reports where police and the people that police interview talk about so-and-so being a Muslim American and then indicating how they look. But like any social science, sociologists have broken racism down into its various components and have looked at each of these components much more closely. So let's take a look at 3 different components of racism. And they are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. As you can see, stereotypes are simplified and unreliable generalizations about all members of a racial group and do not recognize individual differences within that group. Okay, so stereotypes is something that people do more or less, let's say, naturally. Stereotypical thinking invades our consciousness and it interrupts our ability to assess people of different racial groups in fair terms. And so stereotypical thinking is involved whenever somebody says all blacks are violent. And then when they meet an individual who happens to be black, they employ that stereotype and assume that that person must be violent. Prejudice, by contrast, is very related to stereotypes. It's a little bit more specific. A prejudice is a set of negative beliefs and attitudes that lead people to prejudge people from outside groups. So prejudices are often based on stereotypes. Terrence is black. I bet he started the fight is an example of a prejudice. Discrimination builds on stereotypes and prejudices. And discrimination refers to the behaviors which deny opportunities and equal rights to individuals and groups. Discrimination is often based on prejudice. If prejudice and stereotypes are about how you think, discrimination is about what you do. The act of denying privilege, power, and resources to people based on race is an instance of racial discrimination. An example is a security guard that harasses a black man because he believes the man is up to no good and will inevitably engage in violence if not watched closely. In this example, there aren't necessarily resources or power at stake. I suppose power is, but the privilege of not being harassed when you walk into a store because that officer or that security guard believes that you are probably just an honest citizen, not necessarily up to any mischief. That would be an example of discrimination when you don't get that same benefit of a doubt. And then at last, we have institutional discrimination. This is the systematic denial of opportunities and equal rights to individuals and groups. The term describes the way particular institutions pattern discriminatory behavior. So you've got to look to the institution, and you'll recall that we've talked about the components of an institution being values at the bottom that build up to norms, which build up to roles, which build up to institutions, which are composed of multiple people executing their social role within a particular field. It's all of those components together patterning the workings of that institution in order to lead towards discriminatory behavior. The thing about institutional discrimination is no single individual needs to be held responsible. Everybody is doing their part in a way, and often in a very unconscious way. And that's kind of what keeps the system going. And incidentally, that's part of the reason that it's called systematic. It's because all those components of the institution are working together as a system. I would add to this that another reason the word systematic comes into play is because there are 2 separate institutions, or 3 or 4, that are also working together in a kind of interinstitutional system. Again, this is getting a bit academic, but I'll give you an example. So the institution of democracy includes voting, right? Well, for a long time, voting and being registered to vote was an absolute requirement to being selected for jury duty. And since Black and brown folks were less likely to be registered to vote because of the institutional discrimination within our democracy, within the machine that comes up with voting rolls, the criminal justice system was simply by making that rule, which drew from voter registrations as part of the jury pool, was able to draw on the institutional discrimination from one institution and import it into another, so that juries for a very long while were majority white, if not exclusively white, eliminating the idea, the gold standard idea, that one should be judged by a jury of their peers. For Black folks, a number of Black folks were being judged by a jury of white folks that had racial animus.